My name is Michael, and I'm from a small town in Montana. During my childhood, I lived in my grandparents' house, located in a quiet area where rolling hills frame the horizon and the roads are made of rough dirt. People in our town still preserve many old traditions, and holding a wake at home for the deceased is one of them. It was never a shock for me as a kid because I grew up witnessing funeral ceremonies in the same living rooms where we played and ate. However, nothing could have prepared me for what happened when my grandfather passed away. It was such a disturbing experience that even now I shudder at the memory and feel like the darkness from that night continues to haunt me. That experience marked my life and my dreams, and it still follows me whenever I try to fall asleep. When the news arrived that my grandfather had died, sadness settled in the house like an inevitable guest. No one said much, but I saw my mother silently wiping away tears while she made the arrangements. My father walked back and forth, making sure the house was ready to receive all the family members and neighbors who would come to pay their respects. According to custom, the body was to be kept in the main room so that his spirit would have one last night close to everyone. The coffin arrived, brought by a couple of local men we knew, and they carefully placed it in the center of the large living room, where the furniture had been removed or pushed against the walls. The atmosphere felt solemn and heavy, as though the walls were holding back unspoken sobs. I spent most of the afternoon helping my uncle set out chairs, candles, and flowers. I felt sad. Logs in the flames. Friends, neighbors, and distant relatives came and went, all crossing the threshold with measured steps and faces that showed not only sadness, but a bit of apprehension at the atmosphere in the house. My cousins arrived with their parents, and none of us felt like playing or laughing. There was a stifling calm, almost unreal, that weighed on our senses. I took in every detail, noticing my grandfather's pale complexion and the stiffness of his folded hands on his chest. I observed how the candles flickered in the shadows, creating shapes on the walls that seemed to dance to a sinister rhythm. It was easy to imagine strange figures in those outlines. At one point, I thought I saw the profile of a gaunt, elongated face projected on the ceiling, and a chill raced down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks, but something deep inside me told me the night was just beginning. Midnight found us gathered in that same room, some people murmuring prayers while others sat lost in thought. That's when the unthinkable happened. All of a sudden, a heartbreaking wail came from within the coffin. A sound so raw and full of agony that anyone who heard it would have believed it to be the cry of someone trapped in a terrible torment. I remember my entire body shaking with fear. My mother fainted instantly, collapsing to the floor with a dull thud, and several relatives rushed to help her. I stood rooted in place, my legs refusing to move. I saw the terror etched on the faces of my uncles and on my father's face, who barely managed to keep his composure. Nobody knew how to react at first. It was as if the air in the room had become impossible to breathe. My uncle, typically the strongest-voiced and bravest in the family, trembled as he approached the coffin. I watched him hesitate, swallowing hard before extending his hand to lift the lid. The silence was so profound that you could hear the slight creaking of the wood against his fingers. When the lid was finally raised, we were all terrified to look, Yet my curiosity made me glance inside, and I saw my grandfather's body, still rigid and without any sign of breathing. But now his eyes were open, wide with horror, as if he had seen something dreadful in his final moment. A shiver coursed from the nape of my neck down to my feet. People around me began to pray louder, clutching their rosaries in trembling hands. My mother was taken out of the room to recover, while others tried to maintain composure in spite of our fear. According to tradition, we couldn't end the wake under any circumstance, so we closed the coffin again. When he entered the living room, the place where the coffin had stood, he went very still, and I sensed a chill run through him, as if he recognized a presence we could not see. He continued his prayers, but I noticed a grim look on his face. After a while, he told us that my grandfather's soul needed peace, and something had prevented him from leaving at the proper time. He added that on the night of the wake, a doorway had been opened and was still accessible, allowing unknown forces to enter and exit the house at will. That day, as the prayer leader burned incense and sprinkled holy water, I felt something shudder within the walls. It was almost imperceptible, like a faint tremor, or maybe I just imagined it, but I felt watched by an entity that didn't belong to my world. My parents looked at each other in fear. In the end, the prayer leader recommended we hold a special mass, and above all, return to the cemetery to pray directly at my grandfather's grave, leaving offerings and asking forgiveness if anything had been done improperly. He didn't elaborate, probably knowing that the family preferred not to delve too deeply into such dark matters. We were left with a sense of unease, unsure whether everything would truly be resolved, or if we had only witnessed the beginning of something worse. We went to the cemetery the next day, carrying flowers, candles, and a rosary. The town cemetery is an old place, filled with twisted crosses and headstones worn by the sun. The caretaker saw us arrive and greeted us with a nod, but there was an uneasy look in his eyes, as if something was bothering him. He showed us where my grandfather was buried, the earth still fresh. My uncle crossed himself, my mother and I prayed the Lord's Prayer, and my father placed a bundle of marigolds on the grave. The prayer leader came with us as well, speaking. Invocations I didn't quite understand. A cold wind picked up unexpectedly, something icy, like a ghostly hand brushing against me. I almost screamed, but managed to hold it in, glancing nervously around me. Everyone else was still deep in prayer, oblivious to what I felt. The hairs on my neck stood on end, and I knew I wasn't alone. After the ceremony, the prayer leader advised us to bury a personal object of my grandfather's to seal his rest. My mother offered a small medal he always carried in his shirt pocket, placing it carefully at the foot of the grave. We surrounded the cross with candles, and after a few moments, a sudden gust of wind blew out one of the flames. The prayer leader said it was a sign, a warning that my grandfather's spirit was still unsettled. We finished the prayers and left, our hearts heavy and our backs tingling with the fear of being watched. In the days that followed, the house grew quieter, but the silence felt more like a held breath than peace. I couldn't sleep, haunted by those wide, terrified eyes staring at me from the coffin. Every time I closed my eyes, I wondered what he saw in that final moment. Was it a glimpse of the afterlife, or something darker, something that forced him awake to scream one last time? My fear became a shadow that followed me everywhere, and no prayer could truly erase it. My parents tried to return to normal life, sending me back to school, resuming their work, but we all knew the house was different. Late at night, I sometimes heard soft creaks in the living room, like someone pacing where the coffin once stood. My mother found a footprint one afternoon, faint, bare, and stained red, like wet earth mixed with blood. That's when we knew the presence hadn't left. One final cleansing was done, stronger than before, but the prayer leader warned us. The bond between the living and the dead, once disturbed, never fully heals. Years have passed, and though the house is quiet now, every creak in the dark, every whisper of the wind, brings me back to that night, that scream, those eyes, that fear. I've only shared this story with a few people, and most prefer to think it's just imagination. But I know what I saw, what I lived, and that's enough for me. Writing these words even now makes my skin crawl, as if the act of remembering might summon that presence again. But I write to free myself from the last grip of that fear, and to warn anyone who might one day hear a scream from a coffin. Know this: there are forces beyond us, things that prayers may not fully contain. Some spirits carry unfinished burdens into the afterlife, and when that weight becomes too heavy, it spills into our world. My grandfather's soul may finally rest, or maybe he watches over us still, unseen. But one truth remains: between life and death, the veil is thinner than we dare to believe, and once it tears open, nothing is ever the same. The guest with no eyes. I recall with absolute clarity the sounds of that night, a single hum traveling from every corner like a faint drone inside my head, intertwined with Grandma Margaret's relentless praying and the groaning of worn wooden planks as we moved around the old house. The smell of strong coffee combined with that of fresh flowers. Then, as hours slipped away, those flowers mercilessly wilted, leaving a sharp, sour scent in the air. That was my first night spent awake after my brother Michael's death, and it would not be the last time sleep would forsake me completely. Yet that initial night drew a line that split my life in two. My brother lost his life in a car crash in Florida on some random day of 1999, so arbitrary that I never suspected it would end with the worst news I could ever receive. It was unexpected, brutal. We got that call near noon, and my mother, Linda, dropped the phone's receiver, pressing both hands against her mouth. I tried to shout, but a chill took hold inside me. It was a mente, as though the universe stood still and refused to move, confirming the unthinkable. My brother was gone. I had no idea what to do. Everything happened way too fast. The funeral, arrangements, the condolences, the pitying stares, the required paperwork. I slid into an almost robotic state, trying to stay strong, to offer help, to avoid truly accepting what it meant to lose someone so close. But deep inside, I felt hollow, abandoned by all hope. The funeral home was a spacious building, presumably once a grand residence for a well-off family, with high ceilings and a broad hallway leading to the main parlor where the casket was placed. Candles stood in strategic corners, ensuring a solemn, subdued glow. The aroma of melted wax reminded me of age-old religious rites, as if we were conjuring something beyond our grasp. I tried to center my thoughts on reality. That body in the coffin belonged to my brother. My mother, devastated, stared blankly, her complexion grey, while my father kept a terrifying silence, like every word stuck in his throat. People arrived in hushed voices, and before long, a wrenching sob would pierce any attempt at composure. I stood off to the side, pressed against the wall, unwilling to move closer to the coffin or the knot of relatives and acquaintances offering condolences. Something felt like it was watching me, an eerie weight on my back that made me glance over my shoulder now and then, though I saw nothing unusual. As time dragged on, the mood thickened. The flowers that once held a light sweetness wilted with alarming speed, casting a rank, decaying odor. The humming inside my head intensified. I looked at the visitors and sometimes felt their faces were warped by fatigue and sorrow. Soft, whispered prayers cut into the silence at intervals, and certain candles trembled in a way that made me fear they might go out, plunging everything into darkness. I suspected something in those shadows was far from human, and that suspicion set the stage for what happened next, altering the wake irrevocably. Someone, I can't recall who, noticed a boy weeping quietly in one corner of the parlor. He wore no formal attire, nor did he look like anyone we knew, family or otherwise. He crouched low, head bowed, gripping his own shoulders as if warding off a chill. Those who spotted him cast bewildered glances around, unsure of his identity. Despite her devastation, Mom Linda was the first to approach. I followed, unwilling to let her go alone and compelled by my need to understand who this child was. With every step toward that corner, a cold tremor rattled my spine. His sobs grew. Clearer, but they weren't typical cries. There was a thin, piercing tone in his wail, like an echo of something far older than human grief. It burrowed into my mind, merging with the constant hum that had hounded me since the evening began. When we reached him, Mom spoke gently, tears trembling in her voice, but the boy neither raised his face nor uttered a word. She tried again, offering water, and that was when he turned. He turned toward us with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing a face lacking something fundamental. There were no eyes, only hollow sockets, dark as endless tunnels fading into nothingness. The scream in my throat died unvoiced, and my mother's did the same. She staggered back, colliding with a nearby chair. My blood froze in my veins, while that sightless gaze stayed fixed on us for what felt like an eternity. Then the lights flickered twice and went out, plunging the room into total blackness, as the stench of withering flowers became suffocating. I heard panicked murmurs, footsteps moving in confusion, the rustling of dresses against the floor, and amid that tumult, the boy's weeping vanished into a chilling hush. We scrambled for candles and matches, taking precious seconds to bring back a faint glow to the parlor, only to discover that the child was gone. The corner stood deserted, and the toppled chair marked the spot where my mother had tripped moments earlier. No one fathomed his swift escape. Some speculated he had run off in a panic, startled by the chaos, but others, more superstitious or keen-eyed, murmured that such a boy was no mortal child, calling him a wandering spirit that haunts wakes to escort souls. The atmosphere choked with tension. A few guests left earlier than intended, horror evident in their faces. Until then, I dismissed all talk of ghosts as old wives' tales, yet my beliefs started to crack. My hands shook, and I couldn't banish the memory of those empty sockets that seemed poised to swallow my sanity. The wake pressed on out, of tradition, but its mood shifted from solemn grief to raw dread. Each candle flickered and burned oddly fast. The air grew colder in ways I couldn't rationalize. Gusts slithered through the corridors, stirring curtains and drawing out groans from the floorboards. Some found refuge in prayer, gathering near the coffin, or standing with arms folded, lips barely moving. The night dragged on, dense with silence, interrupted by faint footfalls from the hall, or glimpses of something darting across dark corners. Mom Linda stayed awake that entire night, tears streaming relentlessly, no longer flowing as sobs, but rather as a silent, endless river. I felt my nerves edge toward hysteria, my eyes darting about, wary of another child or shape hidden in the dim corners. I wondered if my mind had conjured that boy, but the fact others saw him only deepened my dread. Around 3 in the morning, when everyone was drained, we gathered for one last rosary before a short lull preceding the burial. As we repeated the prayers, I felt a subtle touch on my right shoulder, as though a tiny hand brushed against me. I whipped around, heart hammering, but no one was there. My chest tightened and tears welled, born of terror rather than sorrow. The moment the rosary ended, I headed outside to the yard, searching for air, half convinced that if I remained inside, I'd lose what little composure I had left. My hands trembled, my pulse throbbed in my temples, and the dread gripped me like an unyielding vice. Inside, the hallway was even darker than I'd realized, though the candles in the distance still flickered. My footsteps echoed, each one fueling a creeping paranoia that the boy might emerge again at any moment. I thought I heard that faint sob once more, coming from somewhere near the extra chairs and tables stored at the end of the corridor. The door there stood slightly ajar, releasing a muffled whimper, like a child struggling with heartache. Part of me wanted to run, but morbid curiosity dragged me forward. I nudged the door open, revealing a cramped space lit by a candle on the verge of dying, the stench of decaying flowers sharp enough to make my eyes water, and there he was, hunched against the wall, head down, whining pitifully. I tried to back away, but my legs refused. I couldn't move, pinned by some unseen force. He noticed my presence, went silent, lifted his face, and that void where his eyes should have been held me in place, chilling me to the marrow. In that instant, the candle's flame gave 2 feeble flickers before dying altogether, as though an icy wind had stolen its last breath. Darkness enveloped everything, and a glacial sensation swept my face, like a dead hand tracing my cheek. That jolt shattered my paralysis. I whirled around and bolted, stumbling into a small table, slamming against a wall, barely maintaining balance as I scrambled back to the hallway. When I reached the glow of distant candles, I found several, people watching me with startled eyes. I must have looked utterly undone. No one asked questions aloud, but their anxious expressions said enough. My uncle stepped forward, pressing a glass of water into my shaking hands, and I sipped carefully, gulping air in shallow breaths. Dad placed a hand on my shoulder, the first time he'd shown any closeness all night. Yet, in that brief gesture, I sensed he felt as helpless as I did, unsure how to dispel this nightmare. We spent the remainder of those grim hours in wary silence. When dawn finally came, a handful of relatives mustered the nerve to open the windows, letting morning light spill inside and kindle a faint sense of hope. The notion that sunlight could drive away spectral presences made our exhausted minds cling to any comfort. Still, each time I blinked, I pictured those gaping sockets, and a chill crawled across my cheek, as if recalling his touch. The burial felt just as harrowing, though the boy with no eyes never showed himself beneath the day's glare. My thoughts churned with the possibility he might resurface the moment someone was alone. Mom Linda was beyond worn, not uttering a word about what transpired, just holding Dad's hand while gazing numbly at the casket lowering into the grave. Seeing them so frail tore at me, a knot of sorrow and dread twisting in my gut. Afterward, life trudged on strangely. We stayed in Florida a few more days to manage legalities, but sleep became torture, plagued by images of that child, his vacant gaze and aching cries weaving through my nights. Rumors soon reached my ears, accounts from others who had witnessed events much like ours. They spoke of a small boy who showed up during wakes in dim corners, silently weeping, a herald of misfortune or a collector of souls. Some said he not only led away the dead, but also stole the spirit of anyone who gazed into those hollow sockets. I had looked, I had felt his freezing hand. The stories gnawed at me, depriving me of rest, until I resolved to seek answers. I delved into local legends, speaking with older neighbors, longtime friends of the family, and anyone familiar with the region's lore. Many warned me not to meddle, not to call him forth or name him. They believed the eyeless boy materialized, where human agony simmered, feeding on our despair in the thick of loss. I couldn't let fear reign over my thoughts. I pored over dusty archives, probed the funeral home staff about any eerie episodes, but most refused to talk, or else gave me wary glances, as though pitying my quest or dreading it. At last, I pieced together scattered hints, vague stories of other wakes where someone reported spotting a boy with empty sockets. In most accounts, his presence was followed by a second death or a tragic mishap afflicting a close loved one. The notion that Dad or Mom Linda might be next sent icy dread coursing through me. One evening, while combing through old family files, I stumbled upon a faded photograph. Yellowed and sepia-toned, it depicted a funeral scene, multiple figures standing around a coffin. I recognized my great-grandmother, dressed in mourning, but my veins chilled when I noticed in the photograph's background a hazy shape of a small figure crouched in a posture identical to what I'd witnessed. Though blurred, the silhouette was unmistakable. The boy's face seemed turned toward the camera, yet I couldn't make out any eyes. My hands shook, and I slammed the box shut, the entire room seeming to spin around me as if a single, unbroken nightmare had me in its grip. That night I couldn't sleep at all, feeling my entire life trapped in a looping terror, as though the boy with no eyes had woven himself into my family's saga. I began questioning my own sanity. Was it truly supernatural, or was my grief over losing Michael stirring up hallucinations? But the shared recollections of other onlookers, the flickering candles, and the eerie buzz in my head offered no solace. A short while later, we returned to our home in Chicago. Mom Linda, mired in sorrow, barely ate, spending hours gazing at Michael's pictures. Dad withdrew into a murky silence, declining to speak of anything that might lie beyond normal comprehension. I too kept quiet, wary that voicing it could bring that child's shadow back to life. Still, each gust of wind through the night, every slight creak on the stairs, sent my pulse hammering. Over and over I jolted awake from nightmares, drenched in sweat, sure that if I opened my eyes, I would see him standing at the foot of my bed. Sometimes my cries woke Mom, who would rush in trembling. One early morning, sleep evaded me so completely that I caught a gentle tapping at my bedroom window. The rhythm was irregular, barely audible, as though small nails scraped timidly against the glass. My heart jolted. I sat upright, cold sweat clinging to my skin, and locked my eyes on that window, certain I would see a pale face pressed to it. Yet only my own reflection stared back, twisted by dread. The faint tapping went on for a few seconds, then ceased, replaced by a suffocating hush, like something hovered outside. I felt watched, as if those empty sockets followed me from behind the glass. I spent the rest of that night motionless, pulse pounding, afraid to glance away. In the following weeks, that visceral terror receded ever so slightly, but never vanished. I began to suspect the true horror lay not just in the apparition, but in the burden of death itself, the grief that cracks a doorway for forces beyond our grasp. No logic could shield me from the sense that reality had grown disturbingly fragile. Never again did I see that eyeless child plainly, yet he haunted my sleep. Time after time I dreamed of him lurking in a dim hallway, sobbing that thin, distressing lament, and whenever I drew near, he would turn ever so slowly, exposing those vacant pits. I'd jolt awake, my heart thrashing, unsure of myself. As days passed, the anguish of losing Michael intertwined with the unnatural terror of that creature, creating a crushing weight I carried everywhere. From then on, whenever Mom Linda and Dad David brought me along to someone's wake, because sadly more relatives and friends would eventually die, I braced myself before stepping inside, scanning the corners, bracing for that child to return. My rational side insisted it was just a trauma-induced fear, an overactive mind digging up old horrors. but the smallest hint of flowers left too long in a vase would twist my stomach in knots, recalling that dreadful scene. It all felt like a curse I could never truly shake off. I confided in no one the full truth except for small hints I occasionally dropped, probably to test the waters, to see if anyone else harbored a similar dread. People usually looked at me with sympathy or confusion, so I clammed up. Recounting it forced me to relive that image of his sightless stare, made me sense that suffocating odor of decaying flowers, and pulled me back to the blackest moment in that funeral parlor. I could handle talking about Michael's death, the crash, the sorrow, the heartbreak, but not the realization that I had touched something impossible to define. During my darkest, most silent nights, a prickle across my neck reminded me he was still out there, lurking in the gloom of my nightmares. I didn't know if he was an omen of doom, a mere hallucination, or a spectre nurtured by grief. Perhaps he signaled how vulnerable we are when the ones we love cross the boundary into death, prompting fears so acute they spawn horror incarnate. But in my nightmares he continues to appear. When I close my eyes, I see him with utmost clarity, those hollow sockets and the foul odor of rotting flowers searing my senses. Maybe he's some harbinger of death, or else a twisted reminder of our fragility in the face of grief. Each time I revisit the events of that night, the same terror clamps onto me. The glow of candles that never seemed bright enough, the soft, jarring sobs in the gloom, and that child's blank stare creeping into my mind. I've heard people say time mends what's broken, yet I've learned some wounds embed themselves. Too deeply to ever fully heal. They lie dormant, pulsing beneath the surface, waiting for a stray memory to stir them. Even now, when my thoughts wander too far, I sometimes catch a faint sob, so soft it might be my imagination. But that trace of sound snaps me back into the same vulnerability, scanning my surroundings in fear that he might be there again, crouched in some hidden corner, waiting to be found. Years have flowed by, carrying me onward in some semblance of normality, yet I've never been entirely the same. Losing Michael was painful enough, but coupling that sorrow with the suspicion that our family brushed against something beyond the veil left an invisible mark on my soul. Each day I keep moving, working, interacting, but beneath it all I remain haunted by the memory of that night. There is a certain dread in me whenever I hear about a funeral, an automatic check of each corner, each distant shape, searching for a slight silhouette or a muffled cry. I stay silent, afraid to vocalize my fear that the eyeless child will someday return. But the unspoken terror never fully leaves, settling like a weight in my chest. It's possible he's merely an embodiment of the trauma I faced, yet some nights I recall how so many others saw him too. That knowledge sends an icy wave through me, as though reality itself can twist open around our grief, making room for horrors that defy explanation. Sometimes I catch myself imagining him in a different setting, a funeral parlor I've never visited, or at the margins of a candlelit vigil in some faraway state, quietly waiting. I can see him huddled in a corner, face buried against his arms, until someone dares to approach, only for him to lift that hollow stare. I wonder how many others have seen the same atrocity, how many are too rattled or ashamed to speak of it. Does he move from place to place, drawn by the lament and tears, or does he anchor himself to one family, playing the role of an eerie guardian or escort? I doubt I'll ever truly know. And perhaps that's the cruelest part of this ordeal. At times, I wish he'd show himself clearly, so I could question him, ask what he wants, but deep down, the idea fills me with near-blinding horror. If he were to reveal his purpose, I fear the answer would irrevocably break me, strip away my last illusions of control in a world already rocked by grief. In the years since 1999, I've managed to steer through various challenges, finished school, held different jobs, tried to forge some kind of life beyond the tragedy. Yet the memory of that funeral lingers like a ghost in my subconscious. Day to day, my mind mostly tucks it away. But in the quiet hours, when the house is dark and my eyes refuse to close, it creeps back, as vivid as it was then. The dim parlor, the cluster of flickering candles, the cloying stink of wilting flowers, and that piercing hum inside my skull. When I recall stepping closer to him, I feel that old panic flare up, as if a hand of ice has settled on my shoulder again. I've heard tales of different supernatural beings, weeping apparitions, restless spirits, omens that latch onto people at their most vulnerable. Maybe he's all of those, or maybe there's an even darker truth. Either way, his legacy endures in my nightmares. Even if he never surfaces in waking life again, his memory will forever weigh on me, an eternal sentinel. My life endures, one eye always on shadow, never fully fleeing, that wake in 1999.